The first point that I want to make is that the economic performance that was seen in the first quarter, which is a decline of 23.9% in the GDP compared to the period last year, is clearly, it's an outlier, and I'm pretty sure it will remain an outlier when you all will be even maybe 15, 20, 50 years later, possibly, when you may be plotting GDP growth on a quarter by quarter. This particular observation will remain an outlier, and a negative outlier, which has been caused primarily because of the intensity of the lockdown. You're all economic students, so you would understand correlations and regressions, etc., lines of fit. So I wrote a piece in the Indian Express where I had used data to show that the decline in the Indian case is primarily because of the lockdown. If you plot on the x-axis the intensity of the lockdown as is being tracked by Oxford University, they have an index of the intensity of the lockdown every month. India, for instance, had in the index was 100 for the months of April and May, and then of course it was in the month of June there was some unlocking, and so, but still we had the most intense lockdown. And the reasons for that we can go into if you're interested. I'd be happy to share my thoughts on it. But if you basically take the GDP decline, in all the major economies in the April to June quarter, plot it on the y-axis and plot the intensity of the lockdown on the x-axis, what you get a line of fit which is basically negatively sloping. In other words, wherever the lockdown was more intense, that's where the decline was far more significant. And India sits exactly on that line of fit, being an outlier both in terms of the intensity of the lockdown and in terms of the GDP decline. But the fact that it sits clearly on that line of fit suggests that it is the intensity of lockdown that explains the GDP decline. So that's the first observation I want to make. With the lockdown and the GDP decline, I want to make also an additional comment within this first point itself, which is in this particular chart. If you look at countries like United States and Brazil, two countries that stand out as positive outliers. So in other words, so they're on the line of fit. These two countries sit significantly above the line of fit. And that's because the GDP decline in these countries was much lower. So now, and they also had lockdowns which is far more benign. They didn't have an intense lockdown at all. But it's interesting that these two countries are the ones that have the maximum number of deaths. United States and Brazil have the maximum number of deaths across the world right now. If you look at the number of deaths itself, both of these countries have more than twice the number of deaths that India has had. Now, the population in the United States is 1/4 of India's population. In other words, they have had basically 8 times as many deaths as India. Brazil's population is 1/6 of what India has. And so, Brazil's the number of deaths is almost 12 times, compared to India when you control for the effect of population. So, Brazil and United States have therefore paid a huge human cost in terms of the intensity of the lockdown. Now, this is where it is really important to understand. I'm sure you all must have learned. I would have done some research projects, must have written some term papers where this concept of counterfactual would have been explained, which is in the COVID context, the counterfactual question to ask is, what would have been the situation in India if we did not have such an intense lockdown? India is, as you know, the population is about close to 1.4 billion. and population density is very high. So if we did not have a lockdown, the pace of spread, which is affected by network effects, epidemiologists study this phenomenon, and much like in digital technologies, etc., how fast the technology grows depends on network effects. Similarly, the pace of spread of a pandemic also depends on network effects, which is in turn affected by the magnitude of the population and the population density itself. So if India had a much more benign lockdown, one can do the modeling using the R0 parameter. R0 is the number of people whom an infected person would have infected. So at the start of the lockdown, the R0 parameter was almost 2.4, and it came down to to close to 1.3 during the lockdown, and has sort of stayed there. So using that, you can do the modeling. India would have had close to 70 to 80,000 cases in the month of April itself. And now if you had 70 to 80,000 cases without the health infrastructure ramping up, without the testing infrastructure ramping up, then the mortality rates would have been far higher than what they actually were in the month of April. Also remember, doctors were also going through this learning phase, how to handle COVID. So, if you look at the mortality rates in the month of April, they were about 4.2, 4.3%, while the mortality rates now are about 1.2, 1.3%. So, the mortality rates would have been far higher than the 4.2, 4.3% because the infrastructure wouldn't have ramped up. So, and you can do the calculations with a 6-7% mortality rate, we would have been facing easily 5,000 to 6,000 deaths a day. And then you do the numbers, you can basically then. Now, the reason this is important is, especially in a country like India, at the bottom of the pyramid, typically, one bread earner supports almost 5 people, typically. So, a spouse, 2 children, and 1 parent. So one bread earner supports, 4 other people. Now, while clearly a GDP decline does, affect him, would make him more impoverished, but the counterfactual, which is if that person, would have died, and COVID is much more likely to affect those people who are basically going into work. So if that person had died, you can do the calculation, the 4 other people would have been in far more destitute position than, in the current situation. So, with a pandemic like this, policymakers are faced with this, situation of basically picking the policy choice that is the least or less damaging, because damage due to the pandemic has happened and has happened across the world. So India's policy has actually been driven by this, but it has been humane and has been driven by the principle that while GDP growth will come back, and the evidence also shows that that's what I'll come back to, in my other 2 points. But human lives, once they are lost, they cannot be retrieved. That's the essence of that's the principle by which the policy in India has been driven. So that's my first point, which is that the GDP decline is because of the lockdown, and the lockdown itself, intense lockdown was required because of the kind of country that we are, both in terms of population, the health infrastructure, the dependency of people on bread earners. My second point is related to some commentary that has come, which is said that our economy was slowing down anyways, and this is just a manifestation of the slowing down of the economy. Again, I will use facts and data to actually portray the right picture. First set of facts. If you look at several high frequency indicators, my office, by the way, tracks almost 60 indicators, on a weekly basis, to ensure that we are keeping a tab on the economy based on data, and that that my office is thereby interpreting the economy based on actual evidence. So what we were seeing is till the month of February, the economy was really, was ramping up on momentum, was picking up very good momentum. And this is not an opinion, and actually I'm going to give you data to support it. So if you look at the index of industrial production, the 8 core sectors that basically, impact growth in the economy the most: steel consumption, cement consumption, electricity consumption, power consumption, which is a very important, freight, railway freight, all of which are very important indicators of economic activity. If you looked at those indicators, all these 6 indicators, even exports actually, and indicators had grown, were in positive territory for the first time in the month of February of 2020, and had become positive growth. We had registered positive growth in each of these indicators. Mind you, each of these indicators in the month of February for the first time since July 2019. July 2019 is when these indicators had been positive, so for the first time in 7 months. And all these indicators actually had shown secular increases. Also, a couple of important other indicators, what is called the Purchasing Managers Index. The Purchasing Managers Index is constructed by polling managers, saying what is your view, how are you going to buy more to raw materials to produce more. So it's a good indication of future economic activity. And the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, the PMI is a short form, is reported, and it's tracked both for services and for manufacturing. So if you looked at the PMI, it had grown really well up till the month of February. In fact, the service sector PMI, which is important because India is a service-oriented economy, almost 60% of the industrial activity comes primarily from the services sector. So the PMI for services had reached 58, was touching close to 60%, which means that 58% of the managers were believing that future activity is going to be even better, and therefore they were willing to invest more. And manufacturing was close to 55, 56, again in an expansionary phase. Now, this is when COVID struck. And again, I'll back it with data. If you look at the Google Mobility Index, Google, has been tracking the mobility index ever since the month of, since this year, when COVID started appearing in China. So if you look at the Google Mobility Index, in the month of March, and that is important because this happened in the month of March, mobility came down by 20% in India compared to the January and February levels. If the pandemic had not struck, there was no reason for the mobility to go down. So the COVID pandemic struck India in the month of March. And March is the last month of the financial year where a lot of activity happens. Happens with companies close their books, and so a lot of sales are done. So if COVID had not struck in the month of March, I can easily and can say with confidence that the growth rate for the fourth quarter would not have been 3.1%, would have been far higher, in fact, closer to 6% is the, and therefore the economy in the fourth quarter would have registered a growth rate that was significantly higher than the growth rate in the third quarter, Q3 of 2019-20. This is a very important, observation that actually all of you must keep in mind, because there is this narrative that is actually put out saying, oh, the economy was anyway slowing down, and the 23.9% decline is basically just another aspect to the same narrative. That is not correct, as I've actually pointed out using the data, and the data clearly reveal it. Relatedly, there's some commentators have mentioned saying, oh, because of the 23.9% decline in GDP in the first quarter, 1 quarter of GDP over the last one year has been wiped off. Now, as all of you who are learning economics will actually understand that this confuses GDP as a flow variable, which is what it really is, versus GDP as a stock variable. And it's a flow like actually the amount of water flowing, let's say through a pipe or a tap, in an interval of time. Similarly, GDP is measured, in an interval of time, the amount of economic activity that happened. So to say that 25% of GDP was, what has been lost, is they saying, the stock has depleted by 25% over the last 1 year, which basically takes GDP as a stock variable, which it is certainly not. And the only reason why GDP is measured with the level last year is to take into account seasonality in economic activity. For instance, typically the last quarter, as I said, March, there's a lot more economic activity, and so comparing March, the quarter ending March, with, let's say, quarter ending in June would not be correct, because seasonality it affects that. So that's why it is measured basically with the quarter in the same quarter in the previous year. So that's my second point, which is that the economy was shaping up, was gathering momentum up until the month of February. So, if you just look at the 3.1% growth rate for Q4, you will miss this particular very important point, which is, sort of, opening the hood, if you will, in some sense, opening the hood and looking inside the hood and seeing what the actual, the data reveals. That's my second point. The third point I want to make is on what do we see now? Now that the unlock phase is going on, what do we see in the data? Again, I'm going to use the data from the high frequency indicators. So clearly, month of April and May, the GDP activity declined, and that is seen in many indicators. If you look at for instance, the index of industrial production in the month of April, it fell by 32%. In the month of May, that decline was lower at 23%. In June, it was 13% decline, so from 38 to 22 to then 13%. And then in the month of July, it has been 9.6%. So after a sharp fall, it has actually picked up. And even though it still is in negative territory, but the decline has been much lower. So it's been picking up. That's one. Second, if you look at the e-way bills, which is a good indicator of the trade and activity happening, e-way bills in the month of August of this year are actually 98% of the level in the same month last year, which is August of 2019. So 98%. Now the question that you will some people will ask is, why is it not showing up in the GST revenues? GST revenues are about 13% down in the month of August compared to last year. So why is it that e-way bills are down, only 2%, while GST revenue is down 13%? That's because, the government, given the COVID pandemic, has allowed companies to file their GST returns with a lag. So we've given them a grace period. And that is why many firms wouldn't have filed their returns. And that's why this difference between what you see in the data for the e-way bills and what you see with the GST revenue. So in the index of industrial production, e-way bills that I mentioned, railway freight in the month of August was 106% of the level last year, of August 2019. So 6% higher. And if today the railway minister was also sharing the data on a panel where I was had the privilege of being with him. He was sharing that in the month of September, till the first half of September, the growth has been almost 15% compared to last year. So it was, in fact, again, you look at that, in the month of July, railway freight was 95% of level last year. August 106%. And now first half of September is almost 115%. Again, the recovery. You look at steel consumption, you look at cement consumption, cement production, and you look at power, which is also a very good indicator of economic activity. Power consumption levels are almost the same level, in the month of August as it was compared to August last year. So when you look at these indicators, high frequency indicators, it is clearly that after the decline, which is the one part of the V, there is recovery that is going on, which is the other part, the upward sloping part of the V that is happening. Final piece of data that I will mention is is the fact that the purchasing managers index, again something that I referred to earlier, is now for manufacturing at 52, is a level of 52, which means 52% people now, managers, think that the manufacturing sector is in an expansionary phase. So which is good news for the on the manufacturing sector. Now, so those were my three main observations. And let me summarize, which is first that the Q1 decline is because of the lockdown, intense lockdown, for which itself I gave the reasons. Basically, what the kind of population density, etc., that we have in India. Second, that the economy was indeed picking up, had gathered a lot of momentum in the month of February when the COVID struck, and as a result, the momentum basically got pricked. And third, that in the unlock phase, now the recovery is going on in the manufacturing sector. I will end with some observations on the outlook going forward. I think my main worry remains with the service sector, which is, and especially the the discretionary consumption, the discretionary component of consumption. Service sector in India actually is a very important, is important because it almost accounts for 60% of activity, and so it is, and it is the most affected as well because of the need for social distancing. So people like us, common people like us, we're not going to movies, we're not going to a restaurant to eat, we're not going on vacations. So travel, tourism, hotels, all these sectors are affected. Even sectors like, many people who may have gone for a, let's say, for a massage or, stuff like that, even those are not happening. So a lot of the services sector is affected by social distancing, where demand has therefore taken a huge hit in the so services will be a concern till we actually have the vaccine coming, because it is in this context that this crisis is very different from any of the previous crises which originated from economic factors. If you take the global financial crisis, or the Latin American crisis, or the Asian financial crisis, any of those crises that or even the oil crisis in the 1970s, all those crises had economic factors at their origin. In contrast, this crisis originates from a pandemic, a health factor, and therefore, and a pandemic which requires social distancing. Therefore, services is impacted significantly. Also, what happens is, in a crisis, people like us, or most common people, typically only indulge in essential consumption, do not undertake discretionary consumption as much, and that's something which therefore affects the discretionary consumption, especially and services. Another aspect of services is that typically services are consumed by the richer folks and provided by the poorer folks. Just to give an example, let's say, if you go for a massage, for instance, right? The consumer is a richer person. The provider of that service is actually is a poorer person. And because the richer people are not, are basically are saving and are afraid about getting the pandemic, so they're not spending, on these discretionary activities. That's also, having an impact on the demand for discretionary consumption. So that's something which actually will continue to be a concern. And that's where the investment that the government has made in getting a vaccine as quickly as possible. For instance, we are trying to get the Russian vaccine Sputnik V. Similarly, we're also in the process of getting the Oxford University vaccine that AstraZeneca is working on, because once we have the vaccine, and large section of people are inoculated, then we can resume our normal activities like we were doing pre-COVID. And once normal life resumes, then then the economic activities will also be back to normalcy, and that's when you will see consumption, especially discretionary consumption, coming back with a vengeance, because those of us who have now been yearning to go for a movie would basically go for movies, may indulge a little bit more to compensate for what we have lost. Similarly, we may basically go to restaurants, vacations, etc. And so discretionary consumption will come back with a bang. And that's the and it will happen, as very rightly Ms. Madhavi mentioned, that this too will indeed pass. I will only end with one observation that I say based on my my work in the area of behavioral economics, which is this bias that behavioral economists call saliency bias. By the way, it's a book that I strongly recommend all of you to read. Those of all of you who are interested in economics, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman. In that book, he talks about this saliency bias. In simple words, this bias is that we overweight recent evidence. So, for instance, if we are in normal times, because we are in normal times, the recent evidence is of normal times, we keep thinking that we will be in normal times and do not factor in the possibility of a black swan event. The black swan event may have happened, may have happened, in the past, and therefore we don't put enough weight on that. Similarly, now that we are in a black swan event, a crisis time, the recent evidence is of the black swan event of this crisis time. So most people keep thinking that the same crisis will continue. We do not place enough, probability on the fact that normal times do come back, and they come back pretty quickly after these kind of crises. So we underweight that evidence and just keep thinking that we will continue in this, and that's what oftentimes makes a lot of people far too pessimistic, far too cynical about about what is going on right now, and which behavioral economics highlights actually is not quite rational, and which we should allow for the possible, we should put enough probability on the fact that normalcy will be back. So this too will pass. So on that optimistic note, let me pause and hand over the floor back to you if you have questions. Thank you very much.